Hey everyone. This video is going to be the second half of my take on Destined Death. For the most part, I'll be going over some groups that are associated with Destined Death and the part that some of them may have played in the Night of Black Knives. There are also going to be a few more chances to talk about the Gloam-Eyed Queen's identity since she's so closely tied to the Rune of Death. So first, let's start with some of the places that may have had connections to the Rune of Death. In part 1, I mentioned that it looked like there were some connections between the Gloam-Eyed Queen and Mount Gelmir. For instance, the Black Flame Monk's armor and the Godslayer's seal were used by the Queen's followers, and they've both been inlaid with obsidian. Obsidian is a volcanic glass, formed from rapidly cooling lava, and the only volcano that I know of is on Mount Gelmir. I'd also like to say that if the Queen is the Ice Crone, and Rena, like I mentioned in part 1, she may have even used ice to rapidly cool the lava to create her obsidian. There's a necromancer named Garrus in Sage's Cave near the southern border of Mount Gelmir, and apparently he rediscovered some of the ancient death hexes, like Rancor Call. Then, I think these death hexes were either taken by Rykard or given to him, because he created his magma sorceries by modifying some ancient hexes from Mount Gelmir. I'm pretty confident that the ancient hexes of Gelmir that Rykard found are the same death hexes that Garrus found, because Rykard's Rancor has a very similar name and appearance to the death hexes Rancor Call and Ancient Death Rancor. There's also the fact that there aren't any other hexes that we know of in the entire game. The Thorn sorceries are apparently like hexes somehow, but it's difficult to figure out where the similarities end without knowing what a hex is. One guess is that hex magic is death magic, and Thorn sorcery is similar because it's connected to red glintstones, which are made from the blood of sacrifices. I personally think hex magic could be a sorcery associated with intelligence and faith. The death, lava, and thorn sorceries are the only ones that involve faith, but thorn sorcery may not be considered hex magic because it uses faith exclusively. The death hexes were used by the Deathbirds, and they may not be directly tied to the Gloam-Eyed Queen, but they both wield death-related flames that may have had their color mostly fade away for unknown reasons. If the Gloam-Eyed Queen really is the Ice Crone that taught Ranni about the Dark Moon, then the Deathbird's cold ghost flame could be one of those ties. Most things that are associated with ice or that inflict frostbite mention the Dark Moon. For instance, the Dragonkin Soldier of Nokstella probably has something to do with the Black Moon of Nokstella, and it uses ice lightning. Ghost Flame is a cold flame that inflicts frostbite, so I think it's very likely that Ghost Flame has something to do with the Dark Moon too. The Deathbirds are the descendants of an Outer God's envoy called the Twinbird, so I think that god is the Outer God of the Dark Moon, also known as the Black Moon of Nokstella. The Ice Crone taught Ranni about the Dark Moon, so I think that it would have been Rena's Dark Moon before it was Ranni's. If the Dark Moon was Rena's, and she was the Gloam-Eyed Queen, there could have been a much more tangible connection between the Queen and the Deathbirds. The cave we find Garrus in, Sage's Cave, isn't just significant because he's there though. It's one of the few dungeons that has two bosses. One is Garrus, and the other is a Black Knife Assassin. The Black Knife Assassins wield special knives that have been imbued with some of Destined Death's power. But this particular assassin drops a piece of a veil used on the Night of Black Knives. I think that could suggest that the ancient death hexes that Garrus rediscovered have some kind of connection to the Black Knife Assassins and the assassination of Godwyn. On the Night of Black Knives, Ranni stole a piece of the Rune of Death and imbued some of its power into the Black Knives. Then she gave a small bit of her stolen piece to Rykard as a reward. My best guess for why Ranni would think Rykard deserved such a valuable reward is that he may have used the knowledge that he gathered from the death hexes to help Ranni create the Black Knives, or something along those lines. On that note, there may be some things in Sage's Cave that tell us what the Black Knife Assassins were before the Black Knives existed. Hidden behind some illusory walls are the armor and weapons of the Assassins of Ravenmount. There's a clasp on their armor that depicts two snakes that seem to curl towards each other like the ones on the Serpent Bow. The bow's description mentions a group of assassins called the Formless Serpents, and Gelmir has been the home of the Great Serpent for a very long time, according to the Serpent Hunter's description. I think Ravenmount is an old name for Mount Gelmir, and the Formless Serpents were assassins from Ravenmount. So the armor may have been in Sage's Cave because the Formless Serpents left their old armor behind after they became the Black Knife Assassins. The way I see it is that the assassins once dressed like deathbirds, which were a symbol of death before the Erd Tree. But that probably changed after Destined Death was sealed. So I think the assassins changed too, and wore armor that would symbolize their black knives, which were a new kind of death within the Golden Order. The mixture of serpent and bird symbols on the Formless Serpent's armor could also hint at a deeper connection between the serpents and deathbirds. There are even statues of an animal that looks like a mixture of snake and bird traits in the Temple of Iglay on Mount Gelmir, where we also happen to fight a Godskin noble. Stormveil Castle also looks like it may have some connections to Mount Gelmir and the Gloam-Eyed Queen. In Castle Stormveil, we can find the Godslayer's Seal, the Godskin Prayer Book, the Death Spell Rancor Call, and the Claw Talisman, which depicts a Ravenmount assassin. There's even an attack that the Godskin Apostles use called Black Flame Tornado that's pretty similar to the skill Stormcaller, which is one of the skills that channels the Tempests of Stormveil. There also might be some importance behind the fact that the three areas along the western edge of the Lands Between are associated with a different kind of bird. The Deathbirds have a connection to Gelmir because their death hexes are also called the Ancient Hexes of Gelmir. Cuckoos are associated with the Academy of Realucaria in Liurnia, which is just south of Gelmir. The Academy's soldiers even call themselves Cuckoos, and there are even 2 Cuckoos in the Glintstone Sorcery Crest. South of Liurnia is Limgrave, where Stormveil and the Stormhawks lived back when something called the True Storm raged. They may be different birds with different meanings, but I think it could suggest that the people that lived in Gelmir, Liurnia, and Limgrave had some kind of connection or shared origin. In my previous video, I went over why I think the Gloam-Eyed Queen was a Carian. The Carians are a royal family in Liurnia, so I think that the rulers of Gelmir, Liurnia, and Limgrave could have been relatives or even allies. One of the most important tools at the disposal of the Gloam-Eyed Queen and her godskins was their god-slaying black flame. The flame is described as if it's a physical object that has weight and mass. For instance, Black Flame's protection temporarily gives us an inner fire that defends against physical damage. After the Gloam-Eyed Queen's defeat and the sealing of Destined Death, the black flame used by the Godskins lost its true power and went through some changes. Their depowered flame lost the ability to kill gods, and its color faded from black and red to black and white. I'll try to refer to their depowered flame as something like the Godskin's black flame because at this point it's essentially a second type of black flame. The Godskin's flame lost its power because it was only indirectly powered by the Rune of Death through the Godslayer's greatsword. The greatsword's description makes it seem like it was sort of like an antenna for the Rune of Death's power, transmitting it to all the Queen's apostles. So when the antenna lost its connection to Destined Death, the apostles did too. I don't think it's just an antenna though, because one thing seems to say that the black flame comes from the Gloam-Eyed Queen, while another says that it comes from her sword. If those two statements are both true, my best guess is that the Godslayer's greatsword isn't just the Queen's sacred sword, it is the Queen, or at least her body. The Sacred Relic Sword and Fingerslayer Blade were made from corpses, and they both have blades with a sort of double helix pattern like the Godslayer's greatsword. We know a bit more about the Sacred Relic Sword because we can see the Elden Beast turn Radagon into a sword after we defeat him. The Fingerslayer Blade is a bit more ambiguous though. Its description does explicitly say that it was made from a corpse, but it's almost impossible to say who it's made from or almost anything else about the weapon. My best guess is that the Black Knife Assassins made it from a piece of Godwyn's body on the Night of Black Knives. I'll explain that in more detail when we discuss the Black Knife Assassins, but I think there may be some implications behind the fact that the Fingerslayer Blade was hidden in Night's sacred ground. So, I think it's possible that the Godslayer's greatsword was made from the Gloam-Eyed Queen's body like the other two double helix weapons. I'm not quite sure how or why they became weapons, but I think that the Gloam-Eyed Queen's body became the Godslayer's greatsword when she was defeated by Maliketh. It's still very possible that the Gloam-Eyed Queen isn't the Greatsword. In that case, the Gloam-Eyed Queen's Sacred Greatsword may have served the same purpose that Mohg's Sacred Trident does. Mohg's Trident is called an instrument of communion, and the weapon's special skill seems to either summon a bit of the Formless Mother or allow Mohg to reach her physically. I think the Godslayer's Greatsword could just as easily have been an instrument of communion associated with something like an Outer God of Death. When the Golden Order began, Marika sealed Destined death by using Maliketh as a vessel. Maliketh could use the Rune of Death as a black blade, and he was feared by all the demigods because of this. He was probably one of the only beings that could use the Rune of Death's power, but that changed when Ranni created the Black Knives on the Night of Black Knives. On that night, Ranni stole a fragment of the Rune of Death from Maliketh and used it to imbue the Black Knives with some of the rune's power. It seems like it was pretty difficult for Ranni to steal a fragment of the rune too, because there are some items that could imply she was helped by a few powerful people. For instance, the Blasphemous Claw's description says that it was made by Rykard from traces of the Rune of Death that Ranni gave him as a reward. My best guess is that Rykard learned something about Destined Death from the lost death hexes of Gelmir that Garrus found. Rykard knew enough about the hexes to change them into a new practical form of sorcery, so he may have known how to change fragments of death into new practical weapons. The Blasphemous Claw's description also says that it was meant to be a kind of last resort weapon in case they were betrayed. It's odd that an attack from Maliketh would be considered a betrayal after they stole the Rune of Death from him, so I think Rykard and Ranni may have made a deal with someone that could stop Maliketh from attacking. My guess is that they made a deal with Marika, because Maliketh's remembrance says that she betrayed him somehow, and all of the Black Knife assassins had close ties to her. I think Marika helped Ranni steal a fragment of death by taking advantage of the fact that Maliketh was her shadowbound beast and had to obey her. If Marika betrayed them by breaking their deal, it would explain why an attack from Maliketh would have been considered a betrayal. Marika did try to shatter the Elden Ring, so she was probably unhappy with the Golden Order, to say the least. I think Marika's doubts began when she created Golden Order fundamentalism, which was likely long before the Night of Black Knives. If that's true, I think she may have helped Ranni steal a fragment of the Rune of Death to try and fix things. I think Marika created Golden Order fundamentalism to renew her faith in the Greater Will's plan. The Erd Tree stopped producing blessings and wasn't full of life for long, which doesn't sound like the epic brimming with life that the Greater Will promised Marika. It sounds like she believed that if she could completely understand the Golden Order, she would see the Greater Will's grand plan for a better future, and understand why they had to struggle to get there. So she probably learned that the Golden Order was a sham from the very beginning after studying fundamentalism, and when the Night of Black Knives ended in disaster, she got desperate and tried to shatter the Elden Ring herself. When the Black Knife assassins killed Godwyn, Ranni died at the exact same time. That would have been really hard to do by accident, so Ranni may have communicated with the Black Knives before or somehow during the assassination to time it correctly. I don't really like that though, so my theory is that Ranni never told the Black Knife assassins what she was going to do. Even if she wasn't directly involved in planning the event, she could have learned when they would assassinate Godwyn while she was forging their Black Knives. I think that the assassins wanted to give Godwyn a true death so they could create a mending rune that would restore death, but Ranni betrayed them and ended up trapping Godwyn between life and death. A finger reader underground even calls Godwyn a martyr to death, which could imply that Godwyn willingly died to help restore life within death. One of the big reasons I think Ranni betrayed the Black Knife assassins is because they attack Blythe and Iji near the end of her quest. It's important to note that they don't actually do this until we defeat Radahn and set her fate in motion again. Once Ranni had a fate, she could use the Fingerslayer Blade to kill her Two Fingers. So they sent a baleful shadow that resembles Blythe to try and protect themselves. The sword of that baleful shadow is wrapped in the true black and red black flame, which is the same kind of flame that comes from the Black Knives, but it was sent by the Two Fingers. So that means the Black Knife assassins that attacked Ranni were probably also sent by her Two Fingers. There's also a small but important detail in the circumstances of Iji's death. When Iji is attacked by Black Knife assassins, he isn't being burned with the true black and red flame that would come from the Black Knives, it's the Godskin's black flame. That means the black flame around Iji's body didn't come from the Black Knives. I think that the fire must have come from Iji himself, because he's the only other person there, and his attackers used a totally different flame in their weapons. I think Iji was attacked by the two dead assassins and managed to take them both out before ending things on his own terms. That may seem strange, but I drew a lot of connections between the Gloam-Eyed Queen and the Carians when I went over the Queen's identity in Part 1. The Godskins that followed the Gloam-Eyed Queen got their black flame from an embrace with the Gloam-Eyed Queen. Iji used the same flame, so I think the Gloam-Eyed Queen probably embraced him as well, which would make a lot of sense if she was Rena or some other Carian princess. I'm not sure if using the Black Knives to do their dirty work necessarily means that the Two Fingers were involved in Godwin's assassination, but I don't think that they were. The Two Fingers are envoys of the Greater Will, and it seems like they don't do anything without discussing it with the Greater Will first. As soon as something unexpected happened, like the Erd Tree rejecting us, the Two Fingers had to discuss it with the Greater Will for several months. So if the Two Fingers are involved in the Night of Black Knives, the Greater Will would be too. I really don't think that they were, though, because I'm pretty sure that the Greater Will was very displeased by Godwin's assassination, but we'll discuss that more later. I think a true death could have allowed Godwin to return to life. The Wandering Mausoleums are supposed to be a place for soulless demigods to be reborn. And rebirth is one of the only things that I'd imagine would make a true death any better than the situation Godwin is in now. On the night of the assassination, the Black Knife assassins carved the curse mark of death into Godwin's body, and I think it essentially imbued his body with death. I think that if Godwin's body had died along with his soul, then imbuing him with death would have been the same thing as giving him a true death, and Godwin would have been able to live within death. However, the process of killing Godwin seemed to only allow one full death, so the death of Ranni's body seemed to steal the death of Godwin's body. Then, Godwin's body had been imbued with death, but unlike the other items imbued with death, like the Blasphemous Claw and Black Knives, his body was alive. And just as life can exist within death, I believe that a kind of death within life formed as the Rune of Death grew from Godwin's body as Deathroot. Why exactly the rune grows as a plant is a mystery to me, but my best guess is that it either has something to do with the fact that Godwin's body was buried in the roots of the Erd Tree, or that his body had become something like a kind of seed or bulb. Godwin's body was probably filled with eternal life since he was a demigod, so planting it at the Erd Tree's roots may have encouraged the Deathroot to grow. I think that when the assassins carved the curse mark of death, they took some of Godwin's death-imbued body and used it to create a special weapon called the Fingerslayer Blade. Roger tells us that the Black Knife assassins are scions of the Eternal City, and the blade can be found in a very important place called Night's Sacred Ground in the Eternal City of Nokron. The concept of night is very important to the Eternal Cities. The people that live in the cities are even called the Nox, which is a Latin word that means night. The Nox are waiting for something called an Age of Stars, and they seem to hold their Black Moon of Nokstella in high regard. The Nox aren't the only ones connected to Night and the Eternal Cities, though. Celia, the town of sorcery, has some pretty deep connections to the Eternal Cities and Night. And I think it could have played a part in the Night of Black Knives, too. Celians seem like they could be descendants or allies of the Nox, because the Eternal City of Nokron is right below Celia and they use night sorceries, some of which came directly from the Eternal Cities. The descriptions of some of these night sorceries say that Celian sorcerers are known as assassins that hunt their own. Since the Black Knife armor says that the assassins were Numen, just like Godwin, they were also hunting their own. There are also night sorceries that can make the caster or their weapon semi-invisible. The Concealing Veil Talisman was part of a cloth used by the Black Knife assassins on the Night of Black Knives, and it makes us semi-invisible just like the night sorcery does. You can see this veil for yourself when you wear the Black Knife armor. All the possible connections between the Black Knife assassins, Night, and the Eternal Cities are why I believe the assassins created the Fingerslayer Blade from Godwin's body and hid it in Night's sacred ground. Their involvement may have even been why the Nox were banished underground. I used to think that the Nox had been banished way before the Night of Black Knives, but every time I try to justify that, there's one question I can't answer. If the Nox were banished before the Night of Black Knives, how could the assassins have had close ties to Marika? That would have meant Queen Marika was friends with people that had committed treason, and I think that's very unlikely. All we know for sure is that the Nox committed high treason and were punished by the Greater Will, and I think stealing the Rune of Death and assassinating a demigod prince would be considered pretty treasonous. On top of that, they seem to have created a weapon that could possibly kill a god that had probably never contemplated dying before. An immortal being that realized they could suddenly cease to exist would probably be terrified and desperate to get the weapon and their creators as far away as possible. The Eternal Cities seem incredibly old, however, so I think it's very likely that the Nox already lived underground when they were banished. It may seem as though banishment meant that they lived on the surface and were forced underground, but I think it meant that they weren't allowed above ground anymore. The Nox's backstory deserves a video of its own though, so I'll leave the rest for another time. If you liked the video, feel free to leave a like and subscribe. My next Elden Ring video is going to be about an important concept that I call Divine Commandments. I talked about them a bit on my video on Marika, but the general idea is that I think gods may have the power to give a special command that can't be ignored. Before that, I'll be doing something a little different and making a video about one of my favorite games, Warhammer 40k Darktide. It's a pretty straightforward FPS that has a lot of depth, so the video is going to be about some of the important mechanics that are really easy to overlook or misunderstand. I stream every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 6 to 8 p.m. Central Time, and I make TikToks about all kinds of stuff, from video games to colorblindness. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.